quite a big story developing in Australia. Our royal editor, Hannah Furness, sent us this report from Canberra Airport after the row erupted.
Now this speech, if you can imagine it, happened in a grand hall. It's in the parliamentary building, and it's a celebration for the King and Queen's visit. The King delivered a speech taking in his own memories of Australia, how much he'd enjoyed the visit. He talked about the importance of the First Nations traditions and their land, and generally set the tone for his first visit here as sovereign.
Throughout my life, Australia's First Nations peoples have done me the great honour of sharing so generously their stories and cultures. I can only say how much my own experience has been shaped and strengthened by such traditional wisdom.
Just as the King finished his speech and sat down again, there came this one lone voice.
Give us what you stole from us! Our bones, our skulls, our babies, our people! You destroyed our land!
She stood up, she walked towards the King, and she shouted very loudly, very forcefully, "You're not our King. F the colonies, this is not your land, you're not our sovereign, you've committed genocide against our people, give our land back." The King's own protection officers stood in front of him and waited for her to say her piece. Other security officers from Parliament stepped towards her and escorted her out of the building. Now throughout this, the King and Queen looked to be listening. The King spoke to the Prime Minister very quietly. I have to say, on the faces of quite a few of the Australians present, there was a look perhaps of recognition. It turned out to be one senator called Lydia Thorpe, who is well known as a protester here. In 2022, she called Elizabeth II a coloniser as she was being sworn into Parliament. She's an independent senator, she is an Aboriginal woman, and she is a very, very proud advocate of First Nation rights and traditions.
I wanted to send a clear message to the King of England that he is not the king of this country. He is not sovereign. We are sovereign. To be sovereign, you have to be of the land. He is not of this land. We have been demanding a treaty for decades and decades. There is a sophisticated genocide going on against my people. We have almost 24,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children that have been taken from their families. We have the rape and pillage of our water, of our land. How can he stand up there and say that he's the king of our country?
After the protest was finished, staff of Senator Lydia Thorpe sent out a press release explaining exactly what she was trying to do. It says that she was prevented from handing a notice of complicity in First People genocide to King Charles. She said the Crown must be held accountable for war crimes. Now this isn't the first time the King and Queen will be aware of protests like this. The difference here is the context. This might be something that you would expect somebody to turn up outside a walkabout perhaps doing, waving a flag or holding a placard, but to do it within Parliament House, and it's a senator, feels very different. The King said to be generally unruffled by the protest. He carried on with a really busy day. He completed a few more engagements. There's one more day of this royal tour in Australia before the King and Queen head to Samoa for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. But there is a sense that things have got a little bit trickier.
Well, there have been pockets of protest following the King and Queen around the country. There was a poll carried out after the King's coronation that found that 54% of Australians would vote to become a republic in a referendum on the monarchy. But there was another poll published this week which showed that support for Australia remaining a constitutional monarchy was at 45% compared with 33% support for becoming a republic. There was a referendum in 1999, which was 55 to 45 against. The King's view on this, as always, is that whether Australia becomes a republic is a matter for the Australian public to decide.
It's really an issue that's been put a bit on the back burner in a way, given that referendum in 1999. Successive governments in Australia have seemed pretty reluctant to put it back as a question to the people of Australia. But with us in the studio to discuss the events overnight and the King's broader tour is Australian political commentator and former politician in the state of Victoria, Tim Smith. Welcome to the Daily Tea.
Kamal, Gordon, thank you so much for having me. Delighted to be here.
Brilliant to have you with us. You knew Lydia Thorpe. Tell us a bit about her. I think that would be a good place to start.
Well, I served in the Victorian Parliament for 2 years with Lydia Thorpe. She came in 2017, having won a by-election off the Labor Party. She was a member of the Greens. Lydia Thorpe is Australia's George Galloway. It's the best way I can explain it. She is a political extremist on the far left of Australian politics. She's so left that she left the Greens party when she went to the federal parliament. So she was elected to the federal Senate sometime after she left the Victorian Parliament. She lost the election in 2018, went to the Senate as a Green. The Australian Senate is elected by proportional representation on a list system. It's a very good example of not to have an elected second chamber, so we can talk about House of Lords reform anytime you like. And to be honest with you, the Republic in Australia is a little bit like House of Lords reform here. People in the political class in Australia love talking about a republic, but if you go down to the pub, no one's talking about it. But back to Lydia Thorpe. She insulted the Queen when she took her oath of office in the Senate recently. She was too extreme for the Greens. She actually opposed the referendum for an Aboriginal voice to Parliament because, in her view, it accepted white supremacy, white sovereignty, the sovereignty of the Crown over Australia, which she fundamentally disagrees with. She talks about a treaty with Australia as if she comes from another country. So she doesn't really accept being a citizen of Australia. She's had a number of controversies. She made some horrible remarks about a friend of mine, Senator Holly Hughes, with regards to her autistic son. She actually had to resign as the deputy leader of the Greens because she was dating the leader of a bikie gang while sitting on a parliamentary committee investigating bikie gangs. She has been banned from a gentleman's club in Melbourne for getting in an altercation with a number of patrons at 3 a.m. in the morning. And for reasons best known to herself, she had to be removed by police for lying in front of the Mardi Gras in Sydney. So she is quite a attention-seeking individual.
Given her passions and her controversies, as you've described them, Tim, isn't it a bit embarrassing for the Australian authorities that this was actually allowed to happen, given that she was obviously going to take the opportunity to make her points?
Well, she's a senator, so she had to be invited. And this is the point. This was a formal parliamentary reception for the Sovereign. This is no different to an address by the Sovereign in Westminster Hall. This is our equivalent of Westminster Hall. This is the Great Hall of the Federal Parliament. She is a member of the Federal Parliament. She is a senator. She, by right, has to be invited. And I think most people knew that she was going to pull a stunt like this. She tried to pull a stunt at the War Memorial earlier in the day where the King and the Queen laid a wreath. She was prevented to getting there by the police. Unfortunately, in Parliament, she's got the run of the place, and she did what she did.
How has this gone down in Australia? How have people reacted to it?
Well, a lot of people aren't particularly surprised. It's Lydia Thorpe yet again pulling another stunt. It is embarrassing, let's be honest. You know, our King Charles, is the King of Australia. I'm very proud of that. A lot of people have a different view. But whatever your view, Republican or monarchist, at the end of the day, he is the King of England. He's visiting Australia, and Lydia Thorpe has embarrassed the country. There's no doubt about that.
Gordon, you've been on trips, or certainly one trip, or a couple of royal trips to Australia. We were talking before we started recording the podcast about what you could see from your trips. Just take us through, Gordon, what it felt like going, because it is, for us here, Tim, you're on the other side of the world. It does seem sometimes a little odd that our king, who literally, his house
lives around the corner,
is less than 500 metres away from our offices here in what's called Buckingham Palace Road for a reason. So we're very close to his home. But it seems odd to us that he is still the King of Australia.
Yeah, it does. I think it's something that probably you don't really think about until you go to a country like Australia, and then you have to think about it, especially if you're on a royal trip, because it is a very, very long way away. And it does seem slightly peculiar that they still have a head of state who lives on the other side of the world, who sort of pops in to visit once in a while, that they have a Governor-General. And so you do see it slightly differently. And I suppose I'm interested, obviously, in what Tim thinks about that. I find it interesting that you compare it to House of Lords reform, because I suspect that it's probably one of those things that just doesn't get on the agenda because there are far more important things to worry about on a day-to-day basis. But why do you think it is that even in this day and age, the last time you had a referendum on this, which wasn't all that long ago, people still wanted their head of state to be somebody who lives 12,000 miles away, however?
Well, there's two very good reasons for why the Crown won that vote in 1999. The first reason is that changing the Australian Constitution is very difficult. It's not just a popular vote. You need to get 4 of 6 states voting in favour of a proposal to change. In 120 years, there's only been 8 successful referenda passed in Australia out of 45 propositions to change. And that's a really important point. The Constitution was deliberately written in such a way that it's very difficult to change it. And the second most important point with regards to the politics of this matter is that the Republican movement can't agree on the model. You've got many people that want a directly elected president. You've got many others who want an appointed president by Parliament maintaining the primacy of the Prime Minister. Because if you think about it, if you have an directly elected president, they probably have a greater mandate than a Prime Minister in a Westminster system who's only the Prime Minister because of a majority in the lower house of Parliament. So when you get past do you support the idea of having a sovereign living on the other side of the world versus, well, what are you going to replace it with? That's where it gets really difficult. And unlike the King's 15 other realms, they won an election in Australia. It was the only election the Queen ever won in 1999. So there is some democratic legitimacy to the Crown in Australia that, for example, Canada doesn't have, that New Zealand doesn't have. So if you think about it from that perspective, it's a very democratic Crown in Australia. And in terms of the nuts and bolts of being the head of state of Australia, the only thing that the King does regularly is take the advice of his ministers in both the states and the federal government to appoint the governor in a state or the Governor-General of Australia, and that's it. So, and then once in a while we have a trip like this where inevitably everyone's talking about whether or not we should be a republic, and he makes a speech in Parliament, opens a few things, goes to the War Memorial, which is all wonderful. And for a lot of Australians, this is a really important part of our history. It's a really important part of our culture. You know, my family almost universally came from the British Isles, except for a great-grandmother that came from Italy. So this is that connection to that part of our country. And you know, Australia, as Tony Abbott always said, it's a country with a British past, a multicultural present that has a connection to one of the oldest cultures in the world, the Aboriginal people, going back 60,000 years. And that's the basic premise of Australia.
It's Australia. It's interesting because, it's interesting. King Charles will be leaving Australia and then going on to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Samoa. Is being a member of the Commonwealth also important to Australia, the fact that there is a different club which Australia can be a member of? Now, of course, you don't need to have the head of state being the monarch anymore to be a member of the Commonwealth. You can remain in the Commonwealth since 2007. You can remain in the Commonwealth and also be a republic. I just wondered if the Commonwealth also added to the argument about why Australia needed to keep closer relationships with the United Kingdom.
Well, the significance of the Commonwealth in Australia is really the Commonwealth Games, which ironically Victoria abandoned. It was an absolute disgrace, to be honest with you. That decision by the Labor Party in Victoria was appalling. But the Commonwealth in Australia is, yes, it's relevant, but how relevant is the Commonwealth as an organisation to countries like Australia and the UK, which are first world advanced industrial economies? I mean, I think the Commonwealth's relevance is in places like Africa and the Pacific. And we have a hell of a job in the Pacific ensuring that the Commonwealth remains the main influencer and not China. And that's where I think the Commonwealth has a really important role. And I hope the Commonwealth spends more time and more money and more effort with small states in the Pacific, in Africa, to ensure that it's our values and our influence, not that of China, that, let's face it, does not share our democratic values, wins the day, because that's really important.
Has the attitude towards the monarchy, and in particular towards having the king as head of state, have those attitudes changed since he became king and since the death of Queen Elizabeth II?
Well, the Republicans always said that when the Queen died, inevitably Australia would become a republic. That's not happening. In fact, the Labor Party, which is the party of government at the moment in Australia, are formally committed to Australia becoming a republic. My party, the Liberal Party, is not. There are plenty of Liberals who are Republicans, but officially that's not on their manifesto. But the Labor Party has now decided that any second referendum on the Republic is being kicked into the long grass. I think because, firstly, they lost the voice referendum last year. The voice referendum was going to give, formally Aboriginals a voice into the institution of Parliament. That was dramatically defeated a year ago. And I think at that point, the government thought they're not going to waste any more political capital on issues that most people are not concerned about because, most people in Australia are not Aboriginal. Aboriginals make up 5% of the population. That's not to say that a lot of people want Aboriginal recognition in the Constitution, but people thought that the voice proposal went too far in terms of changing the country. The same as with the Republic. People, they're not talking about it. It's not a major issue, so why would Labor spend more time and effort on an issue that no one's particularly fussed about?
Now, Tim, you said you're an unabashed constitutional monarchist, as you've told us. But Tim, do you think at a stage in Australia's future, it will be a natural progression to become a republic? Or actually, as Gordon, as you were suggesting, the pendulum has actually swung back a little bit more in favour, given there is now a new monarch in the UK, etc.?
Well, no, I don't, because the way the Constitution is written, it's very hard to change. And for an issue as divisive as the Crown, why would you, as a government, knowing full well the Constitution is so difficult to change, why would you bust political capital on something that won't really change the way Australians live? Unless, however, there is an horrific royal scandal of, frankly, abdication proportions that would seriously see Australian politicians and indeed the public reflect on whether or not a future monarch, years down the track, long after I've left this world, might not be suited to the office of King of Australia, remembering that this is an entirely separate office to being the King of England.
Obviously, Aboriginal, what are called First Nation rights in Australia, is a thing that we hear a lot about here. Whether it's a huge priority in Australia is maybe a different conversation. But there is a case around the treatment of First Nationers in Australia has been appalling, and their rates of bad health, the crime that is suffered in Aboriginal communities, the opportunities they are given, this taking away of children, segregated schooling, lots and lots of things have added to the passionate arguments of those that support First Nation rights. That whole conversation has changed in Australia and probably changed for the slightly more positive, has it not?
Well, reconciliation is a very important part of the Australian project. And I think every reasonable Australian knows that, of course, there are many things to be proud about in our history. But equally, there are some shameful moments in our history that we need to deal with. And to walk together to build a better Australia, the only way you can do that is to accept that bad things have happened. We can't undo the past, but we can certainly make the future better for Indigenous Australians. And I think that's where the debate is at. And that's where I hope it continues to be. And Lydia Thorpe doesn't reflect mainstream Indigenous identity or indeed opinion. She's an extremist. Most Aboriginal Australians, like any other Australian, want to get on, raise their kids, have a good education, decent healthcare, and live a better life.
Tim Smith, thank you so much for joining the Daily Tea.
Thanks, guys.